Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to take a look at, well, it's a pretty wild document, to be honest.
It is.
It's the BRUV Party's manifesto.
A call to restore Britain, they're calling it.
Yeah, a call to restore Britain, which, well, lays out a very particular vision for the future of the UK. And it's definitely not pulling any punches.
No, not at all.
So, are you ready to jump into this?
Absolutely. I'm fascinated to dig into this. It's a very curious blend of sort of this yearning for a past that maybe never was, and a vision of the future that's, well, let's just say technologically advanced.
Right. It's like they're trying to bridge this gap between like a very traditional, almost like a romanticized past with this like hyper-modern future.
Exactly.
So one of the first things that really stood out to me was the party leader's, this pledge he makes, like right out of the gate. He calls it a time-limited mission. And he's basically saying, look, give me a shot, let me lead, and if I don't deliver on these promises within a certain time frame, I'm out.
Yeah. It's a bold move.
It's a huge gamble.
Yeah.
I mean, do you think that's going to resonate with voters, this idea of like, hey, I'm accountable. If I don't deliver, I'm gone?
It's tough to say. You know, on the one hand, it could definitely appeal to voters who are just tired of the same old political games. You know, they see a leader who's saying, I'm not here for the long haul. I'm here to get things done. But on the other hand, the sheer scale of what they're proposing, it makes it a really risky proposition. What happens if they fall short?
Yeah.
It could really backfire.
And some of these goals they're laying out are pretty intense. Like, let's just take their stance on immigration. They're proposing a zero-tolerance policy on illegal immigration, going as far as using the Royal Navy to turn back books.
Wow.
They want to deport all identified illegal immigrants. No appeals process, nothing. And the language they use is really strong. Like, at one point, they actually say, if you come here illegally, you will not set foot on this land.
Yeah. It's very forceful rhetoric. And practically speaking, it directly contradicts international maritime law.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There are conventions in place, you know, the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea and the International Convention on Maritime Search and Rescue. These actually obligate nations to provide assistance to those in distress at sea. It doesn't matter their nationality or their legal status. So using the Royal Navy in this way would not only be a logistical nightmare, incredibly expensive, but it could also have some pretty serious legal ramifications.
So not only impractical, but potentially illegal?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, moving on. Another area where they're really not holding back is their plans for the BBC. They call it a rotten institution, and they want to completely overhaul it. They're proposing a shift to purely factual reporting. Okay, that's maybe not so radical, but get this. They want the content topics to be determined by the online platform X.
Formerly known as Twitter.
Yes, formerly known as Twitter, which, let's be honest, is not exactly known for its in-depth, nuanced discussions. And to make things even more interesting, they want to tie government funding for the BBC to a public trust score.
This raises some serious questions about media independence and also about, you know, the quality of the information that will ultimately reach the public. I mean, imagine a world where the news is dictated by what's trending on X, a platform that's known for its very rapid-fire, often unverified content.
Yeah.
This could lead to a very skewed and potentially manipulated media landscape, very far from the balanced and in-depth reporting that we need in a healthy democracy.
Yeah. And speaking of things that might be cause for concern, their stance on what they call traditional values is causing quite a stir. They're calling for a ban on what they call LGBTQ plus propaganda in schools. They want to emphasize a return to traditional family values.
This is a very sensitive area, obviously. And while the manifesto doesn't go into detail about what exactly they consider to be LGBTQ plus propaganda, critics are concerned that such a policy could be used to censor and discriminate against, you know, LGBTQ plus students and teachers. I mean, just imagine a scenario where simply mentioning same-sex families in a classroom could be deemed propaganda. It's very worrying.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope for sure. And this idea of going back to a very specific vision of Britishness is like a recurring theme throughout the document. They talk about limiting non-British residents. They want to replace modern art with statues of British heroes. And they even go as far as dictating like the aesthetic of streetscapes, you know, English-only signage,
Right.
traditional architecture.
It's very interesting how they are very much focused on this very particular image of what they consider to be Britishness. And they seem to reject anything that deviates from that image.
Right.
And, it raises some important questions like, what does it actually mean to be British in a modern, diverse society? Is it about clinging to a homogenous past, or is it about embracing a more inclusive, evolving national identity?
Yeah. Well, on that note of, evolving and preparing for the future, their education reform plan caught my eye. It seems like they're going for a complete curriculum overhaul. They're focusing on entrepreneurship, critical thinking, and financial literacy, which on the surface, it sounds like, okay, they're trying to equip young people with the skills they need for, the 21st century.
Yeah, and that's a valid point. These are certainly important skills. But the question is, at what cost? If we become so hyper-focused on economic success and individual achievement, what happens to the other crucial areas of education, like the arts, the humanities, social sciences?
Right.
I mean,
So-
these fields, they cultivate critical thinking, creativity, empathy, and these are equally vital for navigating, a complex and constantly changing world.
So it's about finding a balance, not
Yeah.
swinging too far to one side.
Right. I mean, a well-rounded education, it should foster both individual success and also a sense of social responsibility. I think we need citizens who can contribute to the economy, yes. But we also need individuals who can engage thoughtfully with the world around them.
Okay, let's talk about their stance on foreign aid and the military. They're proposing a complete cut to foreign aid, redirecting those funds to domestic priorities like schools and infrastructure. And they want to refocus the military solely on defending British borders. It's a pretty major inward turn.
Yeah, it represents a pretty radical shift from, the UK's current foreign policy, which has traditionally involved international engagement and partnerships.
Yep.
I mean, cutting foreign aid entirely, that would have a huge impact on countries that rely on that assistance, particularly in areas like healthcare and education. And turning away from global collaboration, that could really weaken the UK's influence on the world stage.
It sounds like they're putting self-reliance above all else, even if it means potentially straining relationships with allies and kind of disengaging from global issues.
That's one interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems they're advocating for a more isolationist approach, possibly driven by this belief that, the UK can best prosper by focusing on its own internal affairs.
Okay, this next point is bound to spark some debate. It's their plan for the NHS. They're proposing a tiered system for healthcare access. So in their system, British taxpayers and passport holders, they get priority. But for everyone else, it's emergency care only. It seems like a pretty big departure from the principle of universal health care.
Yeah, it certainly raises some ethical questions. Critics argue that a system like this would create a two-tiered society, really disadvantaging vulnerable populations like immigrants or those without secure immigration status. Imagine someone who delays seeking medical attention because they're afraid of being denied care or facing, exorbitant costs. That's a scary thought.
Yeah, the potential consequences are pretty worrisome, and they don't stop there. They're also targeting government accountability and crime. They've got proposals for stricter attendance requirements for MPs, weekly blockchain-powered referendums, a zero-tolerance policy on crime committed by non-citizens, including instant deportation.
It's a lot to unpack. I mean, on the surface, stricter attendance requirements for MPs that might sound reasonable to some people, but weekly referendums on complex issues that could easily lead to voter fatigue and, potentially be manipulated by those with the resources to control the narrative. And that zero-tolerance policy for non-citizen crime, again, it raises concerns about due process and, potential discrimination.
It's like they're aiming for this much more streamlined, tech-driven, and definitely stricter approach to governance. But it's hard to say whether that would actually translate to a more just and equitable society.
Yeah, it definitely raises more questions than answers. And I think it's important to really consider those potential unintended consequences, especially when we're talking about, fundamental rights and freedoms.
All right. Their economic vision is also pretty interesting. They want to simplify the tax code to a point where, and I quote, "it can be understood in under 20 minutes," which honestly sounds like a dream for anyone who's ever struggled with their tax return. But is that even feasible?
Well, tax codes are complex for a reason. They reflect, a country's economic structure, social safety nets. There's a lot of political compromise involved in crafting them. So to simplify it to that extent, it would likely require some pretty drastic oversimplifications,
Yeah.
which would potentially create loopholes for some and, disadvantages for others. It's not as simple as they make it sound.
So it's more of a catchy slogan than a realistic policy proposal, I guess.
It might be a bit of both. It certainly
Okay.
taps into a very widespread frustration with, complex tax systems. But it's important to be wary of promises that sound too good to be true.
Yeah, and then there's the whole Bitcoin thing. They want to establish a national Bitcoin reserve, which, given how volatile cryptocurrency is, that seems like a pretty big gamble.
It's definitely unconventional. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, they're known for these wild price swings. So tying a significant portion of, a nation's reserves to such a volatile asset, that could really lead to some major economic instability.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost like they're overlooking some very fundamental principles of risk management.
It seems like they're placing a lot of faith in a technology that's still relatively untested on a national scale.
Yeah, the risks are certainly high.
All right, well, this next part is definitely the most, let's say, eyebrow-raising part of the manifesto. It's their section on restoring masculinity.
Okay.
They're calling for mandatory boxing and wrestling in schools, easier access to armed security, and they even make statements like, weak men build weak nations.
Yeah, this is where their vision takes a pretty concerning turn. I mean, they're promoting this very narrow and, frankly, outdated view of masculinity. They're equating it with physical strength, aggression, this willingness to resort to violence. And it completely ignores the vast diversity of, ways in which individuals, regardless of gender, can contribute to a strong and healthy society.
It's like they're longing for this bygone era of hypermasculinity,
Yeah.
which is it's just not relevant or healthy in today's world.
Exactly. I mean, we need to move beyond these simplistic and often damaging gender stereotypes.
Okay. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've gone through the BRUV party stance on, well, just about everything, from immigration and the media to education, healthcare, even masculinity. I mean, what stands out to you the most so far? What do you think this manifesto tells us about, the current state of British politics and society?
Well, I think what strikes me is this deep sense of anxiety and disillusionment that seems to be fueling their platform. It's a reflection of a segment of society that feels left behind, ignored by the establishment. They're yearning for, this simpler, more certain past. And the BRUV party is offering them this vision of, a stronger, more self-sufficient Britain. But the question is it a realistic vision?
Sure.
Or is it just a dangerous oversimplification of some very complex problems?
That's a great question, and one that we'll continue to explore in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll go deeper into the BRUV party's more controversial proposals, and we'll examine their potential consequences, so stay tuned.
Absolutely. There's much more to discuss. Welcome back. One thing that really stands out about this manifesto is the way it manages to be both deeply nostalgic for a certain kind of Britain, and at the same time, radically forward-looking, especially in their embrace of technology.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to have it both ways, like cherry-picking elements from different eras to create this, idealized version of Britain. Right.
And some of their proposals, especially when it comes to technology, I mean, they feel like they're straight out of a sci-fi novel.
Oh, absolutely. Take their concept of BBC punishment, for instance.
Yeah.
I mean, they actually propose a 204/7 live broadcast of convicted criminals serving solitary confinement.
Really?
Specifically, those convicted of knife crimes.
Wow.
It's a pretty chilling idea.
Yeah.
Almost dystopian,
Yeah, it definitely had that Big Brother vibe.
Definitely.
I mean, they argue that it's about deterrence, not cruelty.
Right.
But is there any evidence that that kind of public shaming actually works as a deterrent?
Well, not really. In fact, studies have shown that public shaming can often be counterproductive. It humiliates and ostracizes offenders, which can actually make it harder for them to reintegrate into society. And that could potentially lead to, a higher likelihood of recidivism.
So it's more about spectacle and retribution than actually preventing crime. It seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And from an ethical standpoint, it's a very slippery slope.
Yeah.
Once you start using public humiliation as a form of punishment, where do you draw the line?
Yeah, it raises some serious questions about, the limits of state power and the potential for abuse. Speaking of drawing lines, their stance on immigration is pretty hardline. I mean, they're not just talking about reducing numbers. They're aiming for zero illegal immigration.
Right.
Enforced by the Royal Navy. And they don't mince words when they're describing their approach.
No, their rhetoric is definitely inflammatory. They use phrases like, British men died for British soil, and, you have no rights to our land. This kind of language, it's very clearly designed to tap into these deep-seated fears.
Yeah.
And to create an us versus them mentality.
It's almost like they're trying to create this siege mentality, making people feel like their country is under attack and that they need to take these extreme measures to defend it.
That's a very astute observation. And it's a tactic that's been used throughout history. by, political movements who are seeking to consolidate power
Hmm.
and justify extreme policies. By creating a sense of fear and urgency, they can more easily bypass rational discourse, bypass critical thinking.
Yeah.
It's similar to how, some regimes have used the specter of terrorism
Uh-huh.
to erode civil liberties
Right.
to justify increased surveillance.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about their education proposals. On the surface, their focus on entrepreneurship and critical thinking and financial literacy, it sounds pretty good. Like they're trying to equip young people with the skills they need to succeed in the 21st century.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, those are important skills. But what concerns me is this potential for, such a narrow focus on economic success that comes at the expense of a well-rounded education. Imagine a system where the humanities and the arts, even basic science, are all sidelined in favor of, business courses and financial literacy training.
So you're saying that while those skills are important, they shouldn't come at the expense of, developing critical thinking, creativity, and a broader understanding of the world.
Exactly. I think of it this way. If everyone is trained to be an entrepreneur,
Yeah.
who will be the artists, the writers, the scientists, the teachers,
Right.
the nurses, the social workers, all those essential roles
Yeah.
that actually make up a functioning society. We need individuals who can, think critically about complex social and ethical issues, not just those who can turn a profit.
So it's about finding a balance between practical skills and a broader education that cultivates, critical thinking and empathy.
Exactly. We need citizens who are prepared, not just for the job market, but for the complexities of life in a diverse and interconnected world.
Okay. Let's talk about their proposed tax reforms. They promise a simplified tax code, one that can be understood in under 20 minutes.
It sounds almost too good to be true.
It does, doesn't it?
Is that even remotely possible? Well, tax codes are inherently complex. I mean, they reflect the complexities of the economy itself. So a tax code that can be understood in 20 minutes, it would likely involve some pretty drastic oversimplifications. It's like trying to condense the entire workings of a car engine into a single diagram.
Yeah.
You might get a basic idea, but you're going to miss a lot of the nuances and complexities.
So it's more of a catchy slogan than a workable policy.
It's likely more aspirational than achievable.
Yeah. However, it does speak to, I think, a genuine desire that people have for a fairer, more transparent tax system.
Okay. And then there's their idea of establishing a national Bitcoin reserve. And given how volatile cryptocurrency is, I mean, that seems like a huge gamble.
It's certainly unconventional. Imagine if a country had decided to base a significant portion of its reserves on, I don't know, Beanie Babies.
Right. Back when they were all the rage. I mean, that's essentially what they're proposing with Bitcoin. It's a highly speculative asset, no intrinsic value, and its price is driven largely by market sentiment, which, as we all know, can shift rapidly and unpredictably.
So it's like they're betting the country's financial stability on a fad.
It does seem that way. And it raises some serious concerns about, their understanding of basic economic principles and risk management.
Yeah, okay. I have to ask about the section on restoring masculinity. Probably the most, I don't know, eyebrow-raising part of the whole manifesto. They're calling for mandatory boxing and wrestling in schools, easier access to armed security. They even use language like, weak men build weak nations.
Yeah, this is where their vision takes a particularly concerning turn, I think. They're promoting a very narrow and, quite outdated view of masculinity, equating it with physical strength, aggression, this willingness to resort to violence. And, this completely ignores the vast diversity of ways in which individuals, regardless of gender, can contribute to, a strong and healthy society.
It's like they're trying to turn back the clock to a time when men were expected to be, I don't know, stoic, unemotional, and always ready to fight.
Right. And that kind of thinking can be very damaging, both for individuals and for society as a whole. It can lead to toxic masculinity. And that has been linked to, violence, substance abuse, and a whole host of mental health issues. Just imagine, a school environment where boys are constantly pressured to prove their toughness through physical confrontations.
Yeah.
That's a recipe for bullying, aggression, a culture of fear.
Yeah. It seems like they're overlooking the fact that true strength can come in many forms, not just physical prowess.
Exactly. We need to encourage boys and young men to embrace a wider range of emotional expressions.
Yeah.
And, to develop healthy ways of coping with conflict.
Okay. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this section. We've delved into some of the more controversial and thought-provoking aspects of the BRUV Party's manifesto. I mean, what do you think? Is their vision a viable path forward for Britain? Or is it a step backwards into this, I don't know, romanticized past?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While some of their ideas might resonate with a certain segment of the population, particularly those who feel disillusioned with the status quo, their vision as a whole, it seems to be based on a very selective reading of history
Hmm.
and, a rather simplistic understanding of the complexities of the modern world,
So it's a mix of nostalgia and fear-mongering and maybe a bit of wishful thinking?
perhaps. But it's also a reminder that even the most, outlandish ideas can gain traction when they tap into those deep-seated anxieties and offer these, simplistic solutions to complex problems.
Yeah. Well, in part three, we're going to explore the potential consequences of their vision, both for Britain and for its place in the world. We'll also look at whether there are any valuable takeaways from their manifesto, even if we don't agree with their overall approach. So stay with us.
All right, welcome back to our deep dive into the BRUV Party's manifesto, a call to restore Britain. We've talked about their vision for, well, everything, really. Immigration, media, education, the economy. But now let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What are the potential global implications of their platform?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And one of the most striking things about this manifesto is their stance on foreign policy. I mean, they're calling for a complete withdrawal from international organizations,
Wow.
ones they deem detrimental to national sovereignty, a drastic cut to foreign aid, and a military focus solely on defending British borders. It's a pretty big departure from the UK's traditional role as, well, as a global player. It's like they're saying, Britain first, and that's it. We're done playing with everyone else. Do you think this kind of inward turn would actually make Britain stronger?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, their argument seems to be that by, disengaging from what they see as these burdensome international entanglements, Britain can reclaim its sovereignty. They can focus on its own interests. But critics argue that this kind of inward focus could actually weaken Britain's standing in the world.
It seems counterintuitive, right? Withdrawing from global affairs to somehow become stronger? I don't quite follow that logic.
It's a bit like, imagine a sports team, right? And they decide to stop playing against other teams.
Okay.
And they just practice by themselves.
Yeah.
They might get really good at playing against each other.
Right.
But they're going to miss out on the challenges and the learning opportunities that come from, competing at a higher level.
Right. So you're saying the same logic applies to nations.
Exactly. By engaging with other countries, through diplomacy, trade, cultural exchange, Britain can build alliances, learn from different perspectives. They can exert influence on global issues. Turning inward, you risk losing all those advantages.
So it's like they're trading long-term strength and influence for, I don't know, maybe a sense of control in the short term.
That's a good way to put it. Their vision seems to be based on this, zero-sum view of international relations, where one nation's gain is always another's loss. But the reality is global challenges, things like climate change, pandemics, economic instability, they require cooperation, not isolation.
And what about their proposed cut to foreign aid? It seems like that could have some pretty significant ripple effects globally.
Oh, absolutely. The UK has historically been a major contributor to international development, providing assistance to countries that are struggling with poverty, disease, conflict. Yeah. Cutting off that aid could have devastating consequences for millions of people around the world. It could exacerbate humanitarian crises, destabilize entire regions.
Right.
And it's also worth noting that a lot of the problems that they're so focused on, things like illegal immigration, these issues are often linked to, poverty and instability in other parts of the world. So by reducing aid, they might actually be contributing to the very problems they're trying to solve.
It's a bit like trying to put out a fire in your own house by ignoring the flames that are spreading through your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, exactly. Eventually, it's going to catch up with you. Their approach seems to be based on a very narrow definition of national interest, one that completely overlooks, the interconnectedness of all these global challenges.
Well, speaking of narrow definitions, their vision for the economy also feels a bit like, well, like they're looking back at a bygone era with rose-tinted glasses. I mean, they talk about, promoting British businesses, limiting the influence of foreign companies, even hinting at, protectionist trade policies.
It's like they're trying to recreate the economic conditions of the past, back when Britain was this global industrial powerhouse.
Yeah.
But the world has changed so much since then. Today's global economy is highly integrated. Supply chains span multiple countries, trying to build walls around the British economy. That could backfire. It could lead to higher prices for consumers, reduce competitiveness for businesses. It could even trigger trade wars with other countries.
It's like trying to swim upstream against a really strong current.
Exactly. Their vision seems to be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern global economy actually works.
So we've talked about, the potential global consequences of their vision, but even if we set those aside for a moment, let's look internally. Does their vision for Britain itself, does it hold up? I mean, is it even internally consistent?
That's where things get really interesting. Because on the surface, they offer this, seemingly coherent narrative about restoring British greatness, reclaiming sovereignty, putting the needs of British citizens first. But when you start to dig into the details, I think the cracks start to show.
Like what, for instance?
Well, take their emphasis on traditional values and their plan to ban LGBTQ plus propaganda in schools. They seem to be appealing to this sense of nostalgia for, a simpler time, where gender roles were very clearly defined, family structures were more homogenous. But that vision ignores the reality of modern British society, which is diverse, inclusive, and constantly evolving.
It's like they're trying to impose a black and white morality on a world that's increasingly shades of gray.
Exactly. Their vision seems to be rooted in a fear of change, and this desire to cling to a past that, well, may never have truly existed.
And their economic proposals, I mean, can they really simplify the tax code to the point where it can be understood in 20 minutes? Is a national Bitcoin reserve really a viable idea?
Well, I think as we discussed earlier, these proposals feel more like catchy slogans than well-thought-out policies.
Right.
Simplifying the tax code to that extent would likely create more problems than it solves. And basing a significant portion of the nation's reserves on, a highly volatile asset like Bitcoin, that's incredibly risky. It's like building a house on a foundation of sand.
So their vision is this kind of mix of nostalgia, oversimplification, and maybe a bit of wishful thinking.
That's a fair assessment. While some of their ideas might resonate with certain groups, their overall vision seems to be based on, well, this romanticized view of the past, and I think a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern world works.
So we've dissected their manifesto, we've explored its potential consequences, we've even, I think, identified some of its internal inconsistencies. So where does that leave us? Is there anything of value in their vision, even if we, disagree with their approach?
I think one valuable takeaway is that their manifesto taps into a very real sense of anxiety and disillusionment that a lot of people are feeling. Whether it's economic insecurity, cultural change, the perceived loss of national identity, there's a sense out there that things aren't working the way they should be.
So their diagnosis of the problem might be accurate, but their prescription is a little off.
That's one way to look at it. Instead of dismissing their ideas outright, I think it's important to understand, the underlying concerns that are driving their popularity.
So what's the alternative then? If their vision isn't the answer, what is?
That's a question for another deep dive.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with acknowledging the complexity of the challenges that we're facing, engaging in, honest and open dialogue, and seeking solutions that are grounded in evidence, not just ideology.
And maybe a little bit of realism.
Absolutely. We need to move beyond simplistic narratives and, quick fixes and focus on building a future that is sustainable, equitable, and resilient.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on. We've taken a deep dive into the BRUV Party's manifesto, explored its potential consequences, and I think challenged its underlying assumptions. It's been a fascinating journey, and we appreciate you joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.